The silence was the first thing they noticed. Not the quiet of an empty room or the peace of a remote world, but a deep, profound, and utterly unnatural silence that had settled over the galaxy like a blanket. For 500 years the Galactic Compact had governed known space, a sprawling tapestry of 1,000 different species, a symphony of commerce, politics, and war played out across the stars. And in all that time, across all those centuries, one sector of space remained dark, quiet, and utterly, terrifyingly off-limits. They called it the Soul Preserve. A quarantine zone enforced by the Compact's most powerful, unbreakable laws. To enter was a death sentence not just for the individual but for their entire species. The official records were sanitized, vague. They spoke of a biological hazard, a temporal instability, something best left forgotten. But in the shadows, in the whispers of admirals and the secret archives of historians, another name was used. A name spoken with a tremor of fear that had lasted half a millennium. They called it the Cradle. The place where the war gods slept. And we, the Xylans, we were the proud, foolish children who thought the stories were just that, stories. Our empire was young, vibrant, our technology the envy of the Compact. We looked at that silent, dark patch of space and saw not a warning but a challenge. We saw resources, territory, a legacy. The old, trembling races, the ones with memories long enough to recall the last war, they pleaded with us. Do not go there, their ancient ambassadors would croak, their multi-jointed limbs shaking. The preserve is not a prison to keep something in. It is a barrier to keep us out. Let the gods sleep. We laughed. We called them superstitious old fools, their minds addled by time. Our High Council, in its gleaming arrogance, greenlit Project Revelation. A single, state-of-the-art scout ship, the Stargazer, was fitted with the latest stealth systems and sent to pierce the veil of the Soul Preserve. I was the chief xenologist on that mission. My heart wasn't filled with dread, but with the thrill of discovery. I was going to be the one to uncover the galaxy's greatest secret. The journey through the perimeter was anticlimactic. No great energy fields, no fleets of guardian drones. Just an old, automated beacon repeating a single, simple message on a loop. A message in a language so old, our computers had to dig deep into historical archives to translate it. It was just 4 words. You are not welcome. We ignored it. Of course we did. When we dropped out of warp, the sight that greeted us was not one of monstrous war machines or planet-sized fortresses. It was peaceful. A single yellow star warming a system of planets. The third world was a jewel of blue and green and swirling white. It was beautiful. Breathtaking. Our initial scans showed limited energy signatures, primitive orbital infrastructure, and a dominant, bipedal species that had barely reached its own moon. They called themselves humans. For weeks we observed from the darkness. We watched their chaotic, fragmented societies, their petty conflicts, their strange art and music. They seemed so small, so fragile. We saw no gods, no world-shattering power. Just a young race stumbling in the dark. A sense of disappointment began to settle over the crew. Had it all been a lie? A grand, galactic-scale hoax? It was during a routine deep scan of their planetary data net, a thing they called the Internet, that I found it. Buried beneath layers of entertainment, news, and trivialities, was a historical record. A section labeled, The Unification Wars. It wasn't a detailed history. It was more like a collection of myths and legends, but the dates were impossible. They placed these wars over 500 years in the past, right around the time the Soul Preserve was established. The record spoke not of gods but of nations. They used words like total war, scorched earth, and mutually assured destruction. They spoke of weapons that could crack continents, poisons that could sterilize a world, and a final terrible conflict that lasted for a decade and left the planet in ashes. And then the record just stopped. The next entry was about global reconstruction, a single unified world government, and a new era of peace. That was the key. It wasn't that their war-making technology had been lost. It had been put away. The humans, after nearly destroying themselves, had made a conscious, species-wide choice. They had looked into the abyss of their own potential for violence, and they had been horrified by what they saw. They disarmed, they turned their weapons into monuments, and they focused on simply living. The biological hazard was a lie. The temporal instability was a fiction. The quarantine was a peace treaty the galaxy had made with itself. A promise to never, ever give these creatures a reason to remember what they were. My hands were trembling as I presented my findings to the ship's commander. Sir, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We have it all wrong. They aren't sleeping war gods waiting to be awakened. They are a people who chose to forget they were ever gods at all. Our very presence here, it's a violation. We are the threat. The commander, a proud Xylan born and bred, scoffed. A species that chooses weakness is not a god, Doctor. They are a resource. Look at them. They have no fleet, no planetary shields. Their greatest cities are undefended. The Compact has been living in fear of a ghost. He made a decision then, a decision that would echo through history. He ordered a Phase 2 reconnaissance, a low-altitude flyover of their primary population center, a place called Europa City, to gather closer visual data. A show of force to see how these gods would flinch. I begged him not to. I showed him the data, the historical accounts of their wrath. But he wouldn't listen. Pride is a blinding, deadly thing. The Stargazer broke orbit and descended into the atmosphere, a silent, shimmering dagger against the blue sky. We flew low over Europa City, our scanners drinking in every detail. And for a moment it seemed the commander was right. The humans below looked up. Some pointed. Some took images. They seemed curious, awestruck, but not afraid. Not yet. And then, every screen on our bridge flickered and died. For a single heart-stopping second there was pure blackness. Then a single simple line of text appeared on every display in our own Xylan script. Unidentified vessel. You are in violation of the Celestial Non-Aggression Accord of 2247. Power down your engines and await boarding. The commander stared, his face a mask of confusion and outrage. How are they broadcasting on our systems? Jam them. Raise shields. But the controls were dead. The ship was no longer ours. Through the main viewport I saw it. On the ground, a massive, polished granite monument, a relic from their warlike past, a thing we had scanned as inert rock, began to split open. From its heart, a light not of laser or plasma, but of something colder, something that hurt to look at, began to pulse. It wasn't a weapon. It was a key. And it was turning the lock on a door we never knew was there. The ship's internal comms crackled and a new voice came through. It was calm. Terribly, inhumanly calm. It was the voice of a man, but it carried the weight of glaciers, the patience of continents. This is Director Kale of Terran Security, the voice said, without a trace of anger or fear. You have entered a sovereign preservation zone. You have performed an act of territorial aggression. The accord has been breached. The commander, his voice shaking for the first time, shouted back, We are an exploration vessel of the Xylan Empire. You will release control of our ship immediately. There was a long pause. I could almost hear the sigh on the other end, a sigh of profound, weary disappointment. The Xylan Empire, the voice repeated, as if tasting the words and finding them bitter. Your files are in our historical database. Your species was not a signatory. You are, therefore, considered a non-compliant aggressor. I sank into my chair, my blood running cold. We weren't dealing with a government. We were dealing with a security system. An automated, planet-wide defense protocol that had just been tripped. This wasn't the war god. This was just its alarm clock. Director, I said, leaning forward, speaking to the comms with a desperation I had never felt before. Please. It was a mistake. We didn't understand. We'll leave. We'll never return. Just let us go. The calm voice returned, and this time there was something new in it. Not anger. Not hatred. It was something far, far worse. It was pity. It is too late for that, Director Kale said. The preservation protocol is active. The Compact will be notified of your transgression. And humanity. He paused, and in that pause, I heard the sound of a slumbering giant taking its first deep, waking breath. Humanity has been reminded that it has neighbors. And some of them are not very friendly. The connection cut. Our ship's systems rebooted in a flash and control was returned to us. The commander stood there, pale and silent. On the viewport, a new trajectory was plotted. A course out of the system back to Xylan space. It was a gift. A warning shot. But as I looked back at the beautiful blue world of Earth, I didn't see peace anymore. I saw a mask. And beneath that mask, in the deep, dark places of their history and their souls, something old and terrible had just opened its eyes. The war gods hadn't risen. Not yet. They had just stirred. And the galaxy, in its blissful, arrogant silence, was about to learn the true meaning of fear. The silence on the bridge of the Stargazer was heavier than any void of space. It was the silence of shock, of arrogance brutally dismantled. For a long time no one spoke. No one moved. We just stared at the viewport, at the receding image of that blue-green world, now looking less like a jewel and more like a sleeping eye that had just flickered open for a terrifying second. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My hands, clenched on the armrests of my chair, were slick with cold sweat. I could still hear that voice, Director Kale's voice, echoing in my mind. That calm, weary, pitiful tone. He hadn't threatened us. He hadn't roared or postured. He had simply stated a fact like a teacher correcting a child who had made a very simple, very dangerous mistake. And that was somehow 1,000 times worse. The commander finally broke the stillness. He let out a shaky breath, his proud shoulders slumped. "Helm," he said, his voice rough. "Maintain the course they gave us. Maximum safe speed." There was no argument, no bluster. The fight had been drained out of him completely. We had been stripped of our ship, our agency, our very understanding of the universe in less than a minute. As the star of Sol shrank to a bright pinprick behind us, the crew began to move again, their actions robotic, hushed. Systems were checked, damage reports were run. There was no damage. That was the most chilling part. They hadn't fired a single weapon. They had just taken over. It was a demonstration of technological superiority so absolute it felt like magic. I found myself drawn back to my console, my fingers flying over the interface, pulling up the historical data I had compiled. It looked different now. The words total war weren't just historical terms. They were promises. The unification wars weren't a myth. They were a prelude. These humans hadn't just fought with bombs and bullets. They had fought with ideas, with physics, with things that twisted reality itself. And they had stopped. What could possibly frighten a species capable of that into laying down their arms and pretending to be peaceful farmers and artists for 5 centuries? The commander walked over, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a hollowed-out look. "Your report," he said, not looking at me but at the data on my screen. "The one you tried to show me. I need to see it. All of it." So I showed him. I showed him the fragmented records of city-sized fortresses that could walk, of viruses that could rewrite DNA on the fly, of soldiers who weren't just enhanced, but were essentially rebuilt from the ground up into living weapons. I showed him the accounts of the final battle, not fought on a planet, but in the space between planets, where the very fabric of spacetime was used as a weapon. The records called it the Sundering. Whole fleets, they claimed, were simply unmade, erased from existence. "The Accord," the commander whispered, pointing to a line in the text. "The Celestial Non-Aggression Accord. It wasn't a treaty they signed with the galaxy. It was the peace treaty they signed with themselves." He was right. The quarantine, the preserve, it was all self-imposed. The compact in its infancy had just been smart enough, or terrified enough, to formalize it, to put a sign on the fence that said, "Beware of dog." We had just kicked that fence down. The journey back to the edge of the preserve was the longest of my life. Every moment I expected to see a human ship on the scanners following us or worse appearing in front of us. But there was nothing. Just the empty, silent stars. It was as if we were being allowed to leave to carry our warning back home. The thought made me sick. We were now messengers of our own doom. When we finally crossed the preserve boundary, the tension on the bridge didn't break. It just changed. The fear of the immediate unknown was replaced by the dread of the certain future. The moment we were clear, the commander opened a secure, high-priority channel to the Xylan High Command. "Priority Alpha communication," he said, his face ashen on the screen. "Authentication Zulu Victor 9er. Project Revelation is a catastrophic failure. I repeat, catastrophic failure. The preserve is not a hazard. It is a cage. And we have rattled the bars." The face of the High Chancellor appeared, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "Commander? Explain. What did you find?" What could he say? How could he possibly explain? "Chancellor," he began, his voice cracking. "The humans, the stories are true. All of them. They are not primitive. They are dormant. And we have woken them." He transmitted my data packet. We watched the screen, waiting for her reaction. For a long time there was none. She was reading, her eyes scanning the information. We saw her face go from skeptical to confused to concerned and finally to a pale, stark terror that I knew mirrored our own. "This is unprecedented," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "If this is true." "It is true," the commander interjected, a desperate edge to his voice. "They took control of the Stargazer without a fight. They spoke to us. They knew who we were. Chancellor, they have a complete historical database on every species in the compact. They've been watching us all this time." The implications of that sank in like a stone in water. They knew our fleet dispositions, our homeworlds, our political weaknesses. They knew everything. The Chancellor's face hardened, the politician in her taking over from the terrified individual. "This changes nothing," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "They are one system. We are 1,000. If they pose a threat, the compact will mobilize. We will not be intimidated by ghosts." "With respect, Chancellor," I said, leaning into the pickup, unable to stay silent any longer. "They are not ghosts. And they are not threatening us. They are judging us. Our very presence in their space was deemed an act of aggression. We have given them a reason to look outward again. After 500 years of looking inward." She dismissed us then, telling us to return to the nearest Xylan fleet base for a full debriefing. The channel closed, leaving us in silence once more. "The compact will not understand," I said to the commander, my voice low. "They will see this as a military challenge. They will prepare for a war." "And what else is there to do?" he asked, his eyes haunted. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know we are not preparing for the right kind of war. We are thinking of ships and lasers. They are thinking of things we can't even imagine." Back on Earth, in a buried command center that hadn't seen active use in centuries, Director Kale stood before a council of his peers. They were not military leaders, not in the way the galaxy understood it. They were historians, sociologists, philosophers, and engineers. They were the keepers of the peace, the guardians of the slumber. "The Xylan vessel has left the system," Kale reported, his hands clasped behind his back. As per the Accord protocol, they were allowed to depart with a first-level warning. An older woman, her hair silver and her eyes sharp, nodded slowly. "And their response?" "Predictable," Kale said. "Fear followed by bluster. Our long-range listeners have already intercepted their communication to their high command. They are framing it as a military provocation." A murmur went through the council. A man with a kind, tired face sighed. "So it begins. Just as the founders predicted. Given enough time, the children always come to poke the beehive. The question is," the silver-haired woman said, "what do we do now? The protocol is clear for a first contact violation. But this is different. They didn't just stumble in. They came with intent, with scanners active. This was an act of espionage at best. At worst, it was a pre-invasion scout." Kale looked around the room at the faces of the men and women who held the keys to humanity's forgotten wrath. "The protocol is a guide, not a chain. It was written for a galaxy that respected borders. That galaxy is gone. The Xylans are young, arrogant, and now terrified. A terrified animal is a dangerous animal. They will go to their compact and they will demand action. They will spin a tale of a new, terrifying enemy that must be destroyed before it destroys them." "So we wait?" someone asked. "We let them build their fleets, point their guns at our home?" "No," Kale said, his voice firm for the first time. "We do not wait. But we do not react with the anger they expect. That is the old way. The way of the wars." He walked to a large central display, which showed a star map of the local galactic arm. "We remind them." "Remind them of what?" "Of the price," Kale said softly, his finger hovering over the Xylan homeworld. "Not with a bomb. Not with a fleet. We remind them that their technology is a child's toy compared to ours. We remind them that their secrets are not secrets. We remind them that the war gods don't need to leave their slumber to cast a long, cold shadow." A plan began to form, a plan of breathtaking, quiet audacity. It wouldn't be a declaration of war. It would be a lesson. A single, unambiguous demonstration meant for one audience, the leaders of the Xylan Empire. Meanwhile, aboard the Stargazer, I couldn't sleep. I kept running the data, looking for something, anything we might have missed. A weakness, a clue, a shred of hope. And then I found it. Buried in the logs of the moment they took control of our ship, was a data packet. It wasn't large and it was tagged with a simple, clear label, for the xenologist. My blood ran cold. They had left me a message. With trembling hands I isolated the packet. It was encrypted with a key derived from my own biometric signature. It was for me and me alone. I opened it. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a boast. It was a library. A curated collection of human history from the time of the Unification Wars. Not the sanitized versions but the raw and censored records. I saw footage of cities burning under strange, silent lights. I read personal diaries of soldiers who described watching their enemies simply dissolve. I saw the designs for engines that could fold space, and for weapons that could turn a star unstable. And at the very end there was a single text-only file. The title made my heart stop. "It doesn't have to be this way." I opened it. The message was short. "*You saw the truth when your commander saw only a prize. That is why you are receiving this. The path your people are on leads only to ash and silence. We have poured our own ashes into the soil and chosen to grow gardens instead. Do not force us to become gardeners of bones. You have a voice. Use it. Make them see. The next move is yours. But know this. If your compact sends so much as a single warship across our border, the slumber will end. And we will not be coming for your ships. We will be coming for your history, your memory, your very place in the universe. You will become a cautionary tale, a ghost story to frighten children. Do not test us. Asterisk. It was signed simply a friend. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the galaxy on my shoulders. They weren't just powerful. They were wise and they were watching. They had given me a chance, a tiny, fragile chance to stop the avalanche before it started. But how could I, a single xenologist, stand against the gathered pride and fear of an entire empire? The war gods had stirred, and they had handed me a shovel, expecting me to quiet the earthquake alone. And as I looked out at the stars, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that they were already moving, setting their plan into motion. The shadow was lengthening and it was coming for us all. The message burned in my mind, a secret so heavy it felt like it was crushing my ribs from the inside. A friend. The words were a lifeline and a death sentence. They had seen something in me, a flicker of reason in the darkness of our arrogance, and they had chosen me. But to what end? To be a voice of caution in a chorus screaming for war? It was like trying to whisper into a hurricane. I couldn't tell the commander. Not yet. The fear on the ship was a physical thing, a thick, electric haze in the recycled air. The crew jumped at shadow alerts on their scopes, their nerves frayed to breaking point. If I showed them this, a direct, personal communication from the enemy, they'd see a traitor, not an opportunity. They'd think I'd been compromised, my mind turned by some human trick. So I carried the secret alone, the data chip feeling like a hot coal in my pocket. When we finally docked at the Xylan Fleet Base Gamma, it wasn't to a hero's welcome. It was to an armed escort. We were quarantined, not for biological contaminants but for ideological ones. The story of the Stargazer had spread through the command structure like a virus, mutating with each retelling. Some said we'd been hacked by ancient human war machines. Others whispered that the crew had been psychologically scarred, our wills broken by simple telepathic intimidation. The debriefing room was cold and sterile, all sharp angles and unblinking light. The commander and I sat on one side of a metallic table. On the other sat three of the most powerful figures in the Xylan military: Fleet Admiral Korvax, a old veteran with a face like weathered stone; General Zal, whose eyes held the cold fire of absolute conviction; and a political officer, a thin, severe woman named Prelate Vreen, whose job was to ensure our loyalty matched the state's desire. For hours the commander relayed the events. He was thorough, his voice flat and drained of all its former pride. He described the takeover, the voice of Director Kale, the terrifying ease of it all. When he finished, the silence was heavier than any I'd felt on the ship. So, Admiral Korvax began, his voice a low rumble. You are telling this council that a species we believe to be pre-industrial pacifists possesses technology so advanced, they can remotely seize a top-tier scout ship without firing a shot. And that their response to this trespass was to let you go with a sternly worded warning. It was more than a warning, Admiral, I said, my voice sounding small in the large room. It was a diagnosis. They see us as a symptom of the very disease they cured in themselves. Arrogance. Aggression. General Zal slammed his fist on the table, the sound cracking through the room. Disease? They see us as a disease? This is precisely the kind of defeatist talk that weakens us. They displayed a potent electronic warfare capability, I'll grant you that. A trick. A parlor game to frighten children. It does not change the fundamental equation of power. They have one system. We have thousands. They have a population that has known nothing but peace for centuries. Our warriors are born and bred for conflict. You didn't see their eyes, the commander whispered, staring at the table. In the footage from their cities. They weren't afraid. They were curious, like we were a minor distraction. They have forgotten more about war than we will ever know. Prelate Vreen leaned forward, her gaze pinning me. Doctor. Your initial report, the one you compiled before the incident, speaks of war gods and planet-cracking weapons. Do you stand by this hysterical assessment? This was my moment. My chance to use the voice they had given me. I took a shallow breath. The assessment is based on their own historical records, Prelate. Records they have carefully preserved, not forgotten. They haven't disarmed because they became weak. They disarmed because they became too powerful. The quarantine was their choice. We broke the one rule that has kept the galaxy safe for 500 years. I wanted to tell them about the message. I wanted to scream the words, "It doesn't have to be this way." But looking into General Zal's furious eyes and Prelate Vreen's cold, calculating stare, I knew it would be useless. It would only confirm their belief that humanity's real weapon was psychological, and that I had fallen for it. The council dismissed us. The decision, we were told, was now in the hands of the full Xylan High Command and the Compact Council. But as we were led back to our quarters, I overheard General Zal's final, snarled comment to the Admiral. "We cannot show weakness, Korvax. If we let this stand, every minor species in the Compact will think they can defy us. We must respond. Decisively." My heart sank. They were going to do it. They were going to send a fleet. Back in my sterile quarters, I finally dared to access the data chip again. I scrolled past the horrors of the Unification Wars, past the terrifying weapon schematics, and found the file on the Accord. It wasn't just a law, it was a deeply engineered system. A web of sensors, automated response platforms hidden in asteroids and dead moons, all tied to a single core AI deep within Earth. Its purpose wasn't just defense. It was deterrence. It was designed to analyze a threat and deliver a proportional, but utterly devastating response. A response that would erase the enemy's capacity and will to ever try again. Proportional. What would the Accord consider a proportional response to an entire Xylan war fleet? Days turned into a week. A terrible, quiet week filled with the distant sounds of increased fleet activity. Ships were being recalled, formations were shifting. The base was preparing for war. The gossip among the junior officers was a toxic mix of excitement and fear. They spoke of glory, of being the generation that finally tamed the legendary boogeyman of the galaxy. I felt like I was going mad. I was the only one in the entire Xylan Empire who knew the truth of what was coming, and I was powerless to stop it. My friend had given me a task I was failing. Then it happened. It started not with a bang but with a whisper. A junior communications officer, a friend of mine, burst into my quarters, his face pale. "Jurek, you need to see this," he stammered, pulling me to his terminal. It's everywhere." On the screen was the personal, encrypted command frequency of General Zal himself. It was live. And it was being broadcast on a loop, not just to us, but on every public and private channel across the Xylan homeworld and all our core colonies. On the screen, General Zal was in his office, planning the Sol invasion. We could see the fleet dispositions, the attack vectors, the precise timing of the first strike. We could hear him speaking, his voice filled with cold venom. "We will glass their cities from orbit. We will show the Compact that Xylan might is not to be trifled with. The humans are a relic, and it is time they were scrubbed from the galaxy." But that wasn't the terrifying part. As he spoke, text began to scroll down the side of the screen. It was a forensic analysis in real time. It listed the names of every Xylan world that would be left undefended by this fleet movement. It detailed the exact energy signature of the Xylan homeworld's planetary shield, followed by a list of 3 resonant frequencies that would cause it to collapse like glass under a singer's note. It displayed the personal financial records of General Zal and his inner circle, showing vast wealth siphoned from military contracts, evidence of corruption that would shatter the people's trust. It was a demonstration. A flawless, bloodless, and utterly humiliating demonstration. They hadn't hacked a single ship this time. They had hacked our entire civilization. They had reached into the most secure room in our empire and turned on the lights for everyone to see. The broadcast ended after 30 seconds. Then it repeated. And repeated. Panic erupted. The fleet movements halted. The government was thrown into chaos, trying to deny, to explain, but the evidence was irrefutable. An hour later, my private terminal chimed. A new message. The source was untraceable. It was from a friend. The message was even shorter than the last. Asterisk, they have seen the shadow. The fleet must not move. If it does, the Accord will shift from demonstration to response. The next lesson will not be so gentle. This is your last chance. Stop them. Asterisk. I looked out my window at the fleet base. The massive, hulking forms of Xylan battleships hung in the void, their weapons silent for now. But I could feel the tension. The humiliation. General Zal would be raging, his pride wounded to its core. He would see this not as a warning but as an act of war. He would want to lash out to prove his strength. The humans' demonstration, meant to deter, might have just lit the fuse. The war gods had stirred, and their shadow had fallen over us. Now the entire galaxy held its breath, waiting to see if the proud, wounded Xylan Empire would be smart enough to back down, or if we would be foolish enough to force them to fully awaken. The silence from command was deafening. I knew in my gut they were deciding right now. The next move was ours, and it would decide whether our history would continue or become just another ghost story. The silence on the base was worse than any alarm. It was the quiet of a breath held too long, the tense, brittle calm before the shattering. From my window, I watched the frozen ballet of the Xylan fleet, their aggressive formations now looking awkward and exposed, like a bully caught in a spotlight. The public broadcast had been a masterstroke, a surgical strike that bypassed our military and went straight for the heart of our society. It wasn't just a show of power, it was a show of knowledge. They knew us better than we knew ourselves. My terminal chimed again, a sharp, insistent sound in the heavy quiet. My heart leaped into my throat. Another message. But this one was internal, flagged with the seal of the High Command. It was a summons. An immediate, non-negotiable order to report to the strategic planning bunker. My blood ran cold. Had they found out about my communication with the humans? Was I about to be branded a traitor? I was escorted by two stone-faced guards, their grip on their weapons tighter than usual. The bunker was buried deep beneath the base, a fortress of cold steel and humming servers. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear. The same trio from my debriefing was there, Admiral Korvax, General Zal, and Prelate Vreen. But General Zal was a changed being. The cold fire in his eyes had been fanned into a raging inferno. He paced like a caged animal, his uniform disheveled. "You," he snarled the moment I entered. He stopped his pacing and stabbed a finger in my direction. "You, with your cowardly talk and your human sympathies. Did you know about this? Did you know they could do this?" "No, General," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I only knew they were capable of things we couldn't imagine. This proves it. They're not just showing us their teeth. They're showing us they can bite without ever opening their mouths. They've paralyzed us without firing a shot." "Paralyzed?" Zal laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This is not paralysis. This is a challenge. They have insulted the Xylan people, exposed our secrets, and you call it a warning? They have declared war on our very honor." Admiral Korvax, who had been silently studying a star chart, finally spoke. His voice was gravelly tired. "Honor does not win wars, General. Intelligence does. And their intelligence capabilities are, as the doctor said, beyond our comprehension. They have made their point. To continue would be unwise." "Unwise." Prelate Vreen's voice was like ice. She had been quiet, her sharp eyes processing everything. "This demonstration, as you call it, has caused widespread civil unrest. The people are losing faith in the military, in the government. Our societal stability is at risk. This is an act of war, just not a conventional one. To do nothing is to admit defeat. To show them and the entire compact that we can be cowed by a simple broadcast." The argument raged, a perfect mirror of the conflict tearing at the galaxy. Reason versus pride. Fear versus fury. I stood there, the secret of the last message burning a hole in my soul. Asterisk, this is your last chance. Stop them. Asterisk. There is another way, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. All three of them turned to stare at me. The weight of their gazes was immense. What way? Admiral Korvax asked, a flicker of hope in his weary eyes. We don't send the fleet, I said, my voice gaining strength. We send a diplomat. Just one ship. Unarmed. We go back to the preserve border, and we ask to speak with Director Kale. We apologize. We admit our fault. We beg for terms. The silence that followed was absolute. Then General Zal erupted. Apologize? You want us to grovel? To these ghosts? I would rather see our fleet turn to stardust than see the Xylan flag bow in shame. It wouldn't be shame, General, I pleaded, turning to the Admiral, my last hope. It would be wisdom. It would be the bravest thing we have ever done. We would be saving our people from a war we cannot win. Prelate Vreen looked from my desperate face to Zal's enraged one. The politician in her was calculating, weighing the cost of war against the cost of humiliation. I could see the decision in her eyes before she even spoke. The preservation of power, of the existing order, was all that mattered. The general is right, she said coldly. An apology is politically impossible. The people need strength now, not contrition. However, a show of force, a demonstration of our own resolve, is also now impossible thanks to their little broadcast. She paused, a cruel, calculating smile touching her lips. But there is more than one way to skin a beast. She turned to a terminal and brought up a schematic. It wasn't a warship. It was a small, sleek vessel, designated as a deep space science probe. The Whisper-class probe. Fast, stealthy, and equipped with a prototype gravitic torpedo. My blood went cold. A weapon. A very small, very precise weapon, Vreen corrected. Not designed to destroy a planet or even a city. Its yield is contained. But its effect is unique. It doesn't cause a physical explosion. It creates a localized gravitational anomaly that can disrupt space-time, shredding any complex matter within a 1-kilometer radius into its component atoms. It leaves no radiation, no debris. Just nothing. I stared at her, horror dawning. You can't be serious. You want to launch a first strike? After everything they've shown us. It is not a first strike against their population, Zal said, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. He understood Vreen's plan immediately. It is a surgical removal. We do not send a fleet. We send a single, undetectable probe. Its target will not be a city. It will be the location of that broadcast source. The headquarters of this Director Kale. We cut off the head of the snake. We show them that for all their knowledge we can still reach out and touch them. We show them that Xylan wrath is not to be trifled with. The sheer, suicidal audacity of it took my breath away. They were going to try to assassinate the leadership of a species that had just proven it could see into their most secret councils. It was the act of a cornered, terrified animal, lashing out with everything it had left. They will see it coming, I whispered, my voice hoarse with despair. You heard the commander. Their sensors, their understanding of physics, it's like magic to us. They will detect the probe the moment it crosses the preserved boundary. Perhaps, Prelate Vreen said, her smile unwavering. But will they believe we are foolish enough to try such a thing? Their entire assessment of us is that we are proud and predictable. This is neither. This is desperate. And sometimes, desperation is the one card your opponent never expects you to play. The order was given. In a remote launch bay, far from prying eyes and the now untrustworthy public network, the Whisper-class probe was activated. Its stealth systems engaged, making it a ghost, a sliver of darkness against the greater dark. It shot out of the bay, its course set for the Soul Preserve. I stood with the commanders in the bunker, watching the probe's icon on the tactical display as it sped toward the border. My heart was a dead weight in my chest. I had failed. My friend had given me a chance to stop this and I had been too weak, too slow. I had tried reason, but I was no match for the toxic mix of pride and fear that governed my people. The probe crossed the border. The display showed it streaking through the empty space toward Earth. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Nothing happened. No human ships appeared. No energy signatures. General Zal allowed himself a grim, triumphant smile. You see? They are arrogant. They think themselves untouchable. Their slumber is their weakness. But I was watching the data stream from the probe itself. And there, in the millisecond before it reached its calculated firing range, something changed. The probe's sensors didn't detect a weapon. They didn't detect a ship. They detected a sound. A single, pure, resonant note, transmitted directly into its core, a frequency that matched the precise structural resonance of its own gravitic torpedo. On the display, the icon of the probe didn't explode. It didn't vanish. It simply winked out. One moment it was there, a testament to Xylan ingenuity and folly. The next it was gone. No debris. No energy surge. Just nothing. A new message appeared on every screen in the bunker, in the same simple text as before. Asterisk, you have chosen. You were given a shadow and you mistook it for a weakness. You were given a chance and you answered with a dagger. The slumber is over. Asterisk. The message vanished. And then the main tactical display, which showed the entire local sector, changed. One by one, in the silent, empty depths of the Sol system, new contacts began to appear. Dozens. Then hundreds. Then thousands. Not ships as we understood them. They were vast, strange shapes, some like angular crystals, others like living storms of energy, others still that seemed to be made of folded space itself. They were waking up. The automated defense platforms, the hidden fleet, the forgotten guardians of humanity's peace. They were not aiming for the Xylan fleet base. Their trajectories were plotted on a course that led past us, beyond us, into the heart of the Galactic Compact. They weren't coming for revenge. They were coming to have a conversation with the entire galaxy. And they were no longer going to be whispering. The war gods were awake and humanity's wrath was about to be felt by everyone. The bunker was a tomb. The only sound was the frantic, choked breathing of General Zal. The thousands of new contacts on the screen weren't just symbols of power, they were a death sentence. Each one was a monument to our arrogance, a silent scream of a future that was now collapsing around us. They had been there all along, sleeping in the dark, and we, like fools, had thrown a rock at their window. Admiral Korvax slowly sank into his chair, his face ashen. "Gods of the void," he whispered. "What have we done?" Prelate Vreen, her political cunning utterly useless, could only stare, her mouth a thin, bloodless line. The calculation was over. There was no math that could save us from this. But the human fleet didn't attack. They didn't even acknowledge our fleet base. As we watched, paralyzed with terror, the vast armada began to move. It was a coordinated jump into faster-than-light travel, a silent, beautiful, and terrifying bloom of distorted light that swallowed the thousands of vessels. In less than a minute, the space around Sol was empty again. Quiet. Peaceful. They were gone. Where? Where are they going? The commander, who had been silently observing, finally asked, his voice cracking. The tactical computer, still tracking the residual energy signatures, projected their course. The lines didn't point toward the Xylan homeworld. They didn't point toward any of our core systems. The lines reached out, past our territory, into the very heart of the Galactic Compact. They were aimed at the capital world itself, at the seat of the government that had allowed our foolishness to happen. A new, system-wide broadcast flickered to life on our main screen. It was Director Kale. He stood in the same simple room, his expression not one of anger but of profound, weary resolve. "People of the Xylan Empire," he began, his calm voice filling the silent bunker. "You have forced a choice upon us. We could destroy you. It would be the work of a moment. It would be easy." He paused, letting the terrifying simplicity of that statement hang in the air. "But that is the old way. The path of the wars. It is a path that leads only to more ash, more silence. We have tended our garden for 500 years, and we will not let you set it on fire." He looked directly into the pickup, and I felt as if he was looking right at me, right into my soul. "Your leadership believed that this was a conflict of strength. It is not. It is a conflict of maturity. You are children playing with plasma grenades, and you have endangered the entire neighborhood. So we are not coming for you." A wave of confused relief washed over the bunker. It was short-lived. "We are going to your parents," Kale said, and a faint, cold smile touched his lips. "We are going to the Galactic Compact. We will stand in their great council chamber, and we will show them the recording of your assassination attempt. We will show them the arrogance, the fear, the reckless pride that defines your current regime. And then we will present them with a bill." "A bill?" Admiral Korvax murmured. "The Compact, in its fear, agreed to our quarantine," Kale explained. "They benefited from our peace. Now that peace has been broken. The responsibility for enforcing the accord fell to them, and they failed. So they have a choice. They can assume responsibility for your actions. They can dismantle the Xylan military command, dissolve your current government, and place your empire under direct Compact stewardship for a period of no less than one standard century. Or," he let the word hang there, the most terrifying word in the universe, "or they can refuse. And they can face us." The screen went dark. The meaning was clear. Humanity was not seeking vengeance against Xyla. They were demanding justice from the entire galaxy. They were using our crime as a lever to force a new galactic order. They were making an example of us, but not by destroying us. By making us the reason everyone else had to change. It was brilliant. It was cold. It was utterly, terrifyingly humane. In our bunker, the silence was broken by the sound of safety catches being released. The two guards who had escorted me now had their weapons trained not on me, but on General Zal and Prelate Vreen. Admiral Korvax stood up, his aged frame suddenly straight, his voice regaining its command. "General Zal. Prelate Vreen. By the authority of the Xylan Fleet Admiralty, you are relieved of duty. You will be held for trial for crimes of reckless endangerment of the state and high treason." Zal sputtered, his face purple with rage, but he was quickly disarmed and dragged away. Vreen went silently, her eyes burning with a hatred that had nowhere to go. The Admiral then turned to me. His eyes were full of a grief I couldn't even imagine. "Doctor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It seems your friend has gotten what he wanted. You tried to tell us." "There's more, sir," I said, my legs feeling weak. I told him everything. About the first message, the data chip, the plea for reason. I showed him the final warning. He listened, and when I finished he just nodded slowly. "They saw a diplomat in you when we only saw a scientist," he said. "They knew we would not listen to force alone. They needed a voice inside the storm." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "That voice is needed now more than ever. You will be part of the delegation we send to the Compact. You will help us clean up this mess. Weeks later, I stood on the observation deck of a Xylan diplomatic vessel, watching the human fleet. They hung in space around the compact capital world, a silent, breathtaking constellation of impossible shapes and contained power. They hadn't fired a shot. They hadn't made a threat. Their simple, overwhelming presence was the only argument they needed. The Compact Council had agreed to every demand. The Xylan war machine was being dismantled. A new, peaceful government was being formed. And I was there to help guide it. I often think about that final message. It doesn't have to be this way. They had given us every chance to avoid the cliff. We had jumped anyway. And in the end, their wrath wasn't fire and destruction. It was accountability. It was a forced growing up for an entire civilization. The war gods had awoken not to conquer but to teach. The galaxy would never be the same. We had learned a terrifying, invaluable lesson about the nature of true power. And as I looked out at the peaceful, sleeping Earth, now guarded by its patient, watchful children, I knew one thing for certain. Humanity had slept like war gods. But they had awoken as something far more frightening. They had awoken as adults. The silence that settled over the galaxy was different this time. It wasn't the quiet of ignorance or the peace of solitude. It was the hushed, attentive silence of a classroom after a stern teacher has just entered the room. The human fleet, that impossible array of silent guardians, didn't leave the space around the compact capital. They simply stayed. They became a permanent feature of the sky, a reminder etched into the stars themselves. On our diplomatic ship, the mood was a strange mix of shame and grim purpose. We weren't conquerors. We were penitents. Our mission was no longer about exploration or expansion. It was about survival through atonement. I spent most of the journey drafting and redrafting my testimony for the Compact Council, the words feeling both too heavy and too insignificant to convey the magnitude of our failure. The hearing itself was a somber, terrifying affair. The great chamber, usually a riot of color and sound from 1,000 species, was deathly quiet. The council members sat in their elevated rows, but their attention wasn't on us. It was on the three figures who stood calmly in the center of the room. Director Kale, flanked by two others, a man and a woman whose calm demeanors mirrored his own. They wore simple, unadorned uniforms of a deep gray. They were not military. They were administrators. And they held the fate of empires in their hands. The leader of the compact, a being of shimmering light, spoke first, its voice resonating in our minds. The compact acknowledges the OI situation. The human delegation has presented its evidence. The Xylan delegation is here to answer for its actions. I was called to speak. I told them everything. Not just the official story but the real one. The arrogance, the ignored warnings, the secret pride we took in challenging the forbidden zone. I told them about the probe, about the desperate, foolish attempt at assassination that was the final straw. I didn't try to make us look good. I tried to make them understand the sickness that had taken root in us, a sickness I now saw reflected in the fearful eyes of many other species in the chamber. We had all grown comfortable in a galaxy without a sheriff. We had forgotten why the sheriff had left town in the first place. When I finished, Director Kale stepped forward. He didn't address the compact. He looked at me. "Thank you, Doctor," he said, his voice carrying that same unnerving calm. "Truth is the first step. You have taken it." Then he turned to the council. "The forbidden awakening you all feared has come to pass. But it is not the awakening of monsters. It is the awakening of responsibility. Our long slumber was a gift we gave to ourselves and by extension to you. A gift of peace. That gift was broken." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The accord has been violated. The quarantine has failed. So a new compact must be made. Not one of fear but of mutual respect. The Xylan Empire will be restructured as stated. But that is only the beginning." He laid out their terms. They weren't demands for territory or tribute. They were demands for change. A galactic council on arms control, with human observers present to ensure no one developed the kind of world-ending technologies they had buried. A shared historical archive, where the true, unvarnished records of the unification wars would be available to all, not as a threat, but as a lesson. A new law, the first of its kind, making any act of unprovoked aggression against a peaceful species a crime punishable by the unified action of all others. It was a constitution for a grown-up galaxy. There was resistance, of course. Whispers of lost sovereignty, of overreach. But then one of the human delegates, the woman, simply raised her hand. A hologram appeared in the center of the chamber. It was a star map. And on it, one of the systems belonging to a particularly vocal dissenter lit up. Then a schematic of that system's sun appeared, with a simple blinking overlay showing how its stability could be adjusted. No words were spoken. The dissenter fell silent. This was their way now. They would not fire the first shot. But they would make sure everyone in the room knew without a doubt that they would fire the last one. It was not a threat. It was a simple, terrifying fact of life like gravity. In the months that followed, I became a bridge. I worked with the new provisional Xylan government, helping to dismantle the war machine and repurpose our industries towards science and art. It was strange work, like teaching a predator to eat fruit. The pride was gone, replaced by a weary, determined humility. We had been humbled but not broken. We had been given a second chance we absolutely did not deserve. One day I received a personal invitation. Director Kale requested my presence on a shuttle. We flew not to a warship, but to one of the smaller, crystalline human vessels. Inside it was not a cold, military barracks. It was a garden. There were trees and the sound of running water and the smell of damp earth. In the center there was a simple stone monument. Names were carved into it, thousands upon thousands of them. The lost, Kale said standing beside me. From the final battle of the Unification Wars. We bring this with us everywhere we go. To remember the price of forgetting our own humanity. I looked at the names, the countless lives lost in a war so terrible it scared a species into becoming pacifists for half a millennium. You could have taken everything, I whispered. Why show us such mercy? Kale looked at the monument, his face etched with a deep, ancient sorrow. Because we remember what it's like to be you, he said softly. We remember the arrogance, the thrill of power, the belief that might makes right. We remember the point of no return, that moment when you've become the very monster you swore to destroy. He turned to me and his eyes were clear and focused. We are not war gods, Doctor. We are survivors. We are the ones who looked into the abyss and managed to climb back out. This, he gestured to the ship, to the fleet outside, this isn't a weapon. It's a guardrail. To make sure no one else falls in. In that moment I finally understood. The Forbidden Awakening wasn't about humanity unleashing its power. It was about humanity accepting its duty. The duty to be the adults in the room, the ones who had seen the worst that life had to offer and had chosen to be better. Their wrath was not in destruction, but in the absolute, unwavering refusal to let the cycle of violence continue. They had awoken to stand guard over peace itself. I returned to my work with a new heart. The galaxy was changing. It was slower, more careful, more respectful. The human fleet eventually withdrew from the compact capital, but they didn't disappear. They patrolled the borders, silent, watchful sentinels. Years later, I stood on the surface of a restored Xylan world, now a center for learning and diplomacy. I looked up at the night sky, at the familiar constellations. One new, small star shone with a steady, gentle light. It was a human watchtower, a promise and a warning. The war gods slept no more. But they had not come for conquest. They had come to ensure that every species in the galaxy, from the mightiest to the smallest, would have the chance to grow up in peace, to learn from humanity's mistakes, and to hopefully one day become guardians themselves. The silence of the stars was no longer frightening. It was peaceful. It was protected. And for the first time since our foolish journey began, I felt not fear but hope.